Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The morning of October 15th, 1824, began like any other in the coastal town of Millbrook, Maine, with the salt-laden fog rolling in from Penobscot Bay and the familiar sounds of fishermen preparing their nets for the day's work. Constable Jeremiah Blackwood's official report, preserved in the Cumberland County Archives, documents what would become one of the most shocking discoveries in Maine's early statehood history. A discovery that would forever change the reputation of the seemingly respectable boarding house operated by Mrs. Mary Holloway. The investigation began with a complaint from Mr. Thomas Whitman, a traveling merchant who had been staying at Holloway's establishment for nearly a week. Whitman had approached Constable Blackwood with concerns about a persistent and increasingly nauseating odor emanating from the basement of the boarding house, and smell that Mrs. Holloway had dismissed as spoiled preserves from the previous autumn. "And the stench has become unbearable," Whitman reported, and when I mentioned it to other guests, several admitted they had noticed it as well but had been reluctant to complain about their accommodations. Mrs. Mary Holloway had operated her boarding house on Elm Street for nearly 8 years, establishing herself as a pillar of the small community through her charitable works and her reputation for providing clean, affordable lodging to travelers and seasonal workers. The two-story colonial structure, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, had become a familiar landmark for those seeking temporary accommodation in Millbrook. Constable Blackwood's notes describe a woman in her mid-40s, of average height and unremarkable appearance, who had always conducted herself with the propriety expected of a respectable widow managing a business establishment. The constable's initial visit to the boarding house on the afternoon of October 14th had been intended as a routine inquiry to address Mr. Whitman's complaint. Mrs. Holloway had received him cordially, offering tea and expressing concern that any unpleasant odors might be affecting her guests' comfort. She had readily agreed to accompany him to the basement to investigate the source of the smell, maintaining throughout the conversation the demeanor of a conscientious proprietress eager to resolve any issues with her establishment. The basement of the Holloway boarding house was accessed through a narrow wooden staircase that descended from the kitchen. Constable Blackwood's report describes a typical cellar space with stone walls, a dirt floor, and wooden shelving that held the usual assortment of preserved foods, household supplies, and seasonal items. The odor that had prompted the complaint was indeed present, though Mrs. Holloway continued to attribute it to spoiled preserves that she claimed to have been meaning to dispose of for several weeks. However, Constable Blackwood's experience in investigating various crimes had given him a familiarity with the scent of decomposition that Mrs. Holloway's explanation could not adequately address. His report notes that the smell was far too strong and too distinctly organic to be explained by spoiled vegetables or fruits. More significantly, the odor seemed to be emanating not from the shelving areas where preserves would logically be stored, but from the earthen floor itself, particularly from an area near the far wall where the dirt appeared to have been recently disturbed. The constable's decision to return the following morning with additional men and tools proved to be one of the most consequential law enforcement decisions in Maine's early history. Armed with shovels and accompanied by Deputy Marshal Samuel Crane and 2 local volunteers, Blackwood began a systematic excavation of the basement floor, starting with the area where the soil showed signs of recent disturbance. Mrs. Holloway had initially protested this intrusion, claiming that the digging would damage her property and disrupt her business. But her objections had been overruled by the constable's authority. The first discovery came within an hour of beginning the excavation. At a depth of approximately 3 feet, the men uncovered what appeared to be human remains wrapped in a deteriorating woolen blanket. The condition of the remains suggested they had been buried for several months, and the presence of personal effects, including a distinctive brass button from a merchant's coat, indicated that this was not an ancient burial but a recent interment. This initial discovery transformed what had begun as a routine investigation into a major criminal inquiry. Constable Blackwood immediately expanded the excavation to cover the entire basement floor, while Deputy Marshal Crane took Mrs. Holloway into custody for questioning. The boarding house was cleared of guests and sealed as a crime scene, beginning a process that would ultimately reveal the full scope of Mary Holloway's activities. The excavation of Mary Holloway's basement continued for 6 grueling days, transforming the once tidy cellar into an archaeological nightmare that would haunt the investigators for the remainder of their lives. Deputy Marshal Samuel Crane's meticulous field notes, written in his careful script and preserved in the Maine State Archives, provide a detailed account of the systematic uncovering of what authorities would eventually determine to be 19 separate burial sites beneath the boarding house floor. The second body was discovered on the morning of October 16th, located approximately 4 feet from the first grave and buried at a similar depth. Unlike the initial remains, which had been wrapped in a blanket, this victim had been interred wearing what appeared to be the clothing in which they had died, a simple brown wool dress that suggested the deceased had been a woman of modest means. Deputy Crane's notes indicate that the body showed signs of trauma to the skull, though the advanced state of decomposition made it difficult to determine the exact cause of death without a more thorough medical examination. As the excavation expanded, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The graves were arranged in a roughly systematic fashion, suggesting that Mrs. Holloway had planned the burials with considerable forethought rather than disposing of bodies in a haphazard manner. Each burial site was approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, dug to a depth that would prevent casual discovery while remaining shallow enough for a single person to manage. The spacing between graves indicated that Mrs. Holloway had been careful to maximize the use of available space while ensuring that each burial remained separate from the others. Deputy Crane's investigation revealed that the basement had been modified specifically to accommodate these burials. The original stone foundation had been partially excavated to create additional depth, and wooden supports had been installed to prevent the floor above from sagging as the soil was removed and replaced. This level of preparation suggested that Mrs. Holloway had been planning her activities for some time before the first murder occurred, and that she had anticipated the need to dispose of multiple bodies over an extended period. The third and fourth bodies were uncovered on October 17th, both showing evidence of violent death. One victim, identified by clothing and personal effects as a traveling salesman, had suffered what appeared to be multiple stab wounds to the torso. The other, a young woman whose simple dress and calloused hands suggested she had been a domestic worker, showed signs of strangulation. Deputy Crane noted that both bodies had been buried with their personal belongings, including money pouches that remained intact, indicating that robbery had not been the primary motive for the killings. As word of the discoveries spread throughout Millbrook and the surrounding communities, crowds began to gather outside the boarding house, creating a carnival-like atmosphere that complicated the investigation. Local residents, who had known Mrs. Holloway as a respectable member of the community, struggled to reconcile their previous impressions with the mounting evidence of her crimes. Deputy Crane's notes describe the psychological impact of the investigation on the townspeople. The citizens of Millbrook appear to be in a state of collective shock, unable to comprehend how such horrors could have been perpetrated in their midst by someone they had trusted and respected. The investigation team was expanded on October 18th to include Dr. Nathaniel Morse, a physician from Portland who had experience in examining remains for legal purposes. Dr. Morse's preliminary examinations confirmed that the victims had died from various forms of violence, including stabbing, strangulation, and blunt force trauma to the head. His professional assessment suggested that the murders had been committed by someone with sufficient knowledge of human anatomy to ensure quick death, indicating that Mrs. Holloway possessed skills that went beyond those typically associated with boarding house management. By October 19th, the excavation had revealed 12 separate burial sites, each containing the remains of individuals who had presumably been guests at the boarding house. The victims appeared to represent a cross-section of the traveling population that frequented such establishments: merchants, laborers, domestic workers, and individuals whose occupations could not be determined from their remains. Deputy Crane noted that the diversity of the victims suggested that Mrs. Holloway had not targeted any specific type of person, but had instead selected victims based on opportunity and convenience. The most disturbing discovery came on October 20th, when the excavation team uncovered the remains of what appeared to be a child, buried in a small grave near the basement's eastern wall. The presence of a juvenile victim added a new dimension of horror to the investigation and raised questions about whether Mrs. Holloway had been operating alone or had accomplices who had assisted in her crimes. Dr. Morse's examination of the child's remains indicated death by poisoning, suggesting that Mrs. Holloway had employed different methods depending on the age and physical capabilities of her victims. The final phase of the excavation revealed 7 additional bodies, bringing the total count to 19 victims. These last discoveries included the remains of 2 elderly individuals and what appeared to be a family group consisting of a man, woman, and teenage boy who had been buried in adjacent graves. The systematic nature of these final burials suggested that Mrs. Holloway had continued her activities until very recently, possibly within weeks of the investigation's beginning. The interrogation of Mary Holloway began on October 21, 1824, in the sparse confines of the Millbrook Jail, a single-room stone building that had never been intended to house a suspect of such magnitude. Sheriff William Thornton's complete transcript of the questioning, written in shorthand and later transcribed for the court records, reveals a woman whose calm demeanor and rational responses prove far more unsettling than any display of madness or remorse would have been. Mrs. Holloway had maintained her composure throughout the 6 days of excavation, watching from the jail's single-barred window as the investigators systematically unearthed the evidence of her crimes. When Sheriff Thornton entered the cell on that grey October morning, he found her sitting upright on the wooden bench that served as both seat and bed, her graying hair neatly arranged and her simple brown dress as tidy as circumstances would allow. Her first words, as recorded in the transcript, set the tone for what would become one of the most chilling confessions in American criminal history. "I suppose you'll be wanting to know about my guests, Sheriff Thornton." The sheriff's initial questions focused on establishing the basic facts of Mrs. Holloway's operation. She readily admitted to operating the boarding house for 8 years, confirming that she had inherited the property from her deceased husband, Ezekiel Holloway, who had died of consumption in 1816. Her responses revealed a woman of surprising education and articulation, speaking with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to conducting business and managing affairs. When asked about the bodies discovered in her basement, she showed no signs of distress or denial, instead treating the inquiry as though it were a routine business discussion. "Each of those individuals was a guest in my establishment," Mrs. Holloway explained with disturbing matter-of-factness. "Right-o, they came to me seeking accommodation, and I provided them with the most permanent lodging available. I fail to see why this should be considered unusual, given that death is the natural conclusion of every human journey." Sheriff Thornton noted in his observations that Mrs. Holloway's tone remained conversational throughout this admission, as though she were discussing the weather rather than confessing to multiple murders. The interrogation revealed that Mrs. Holloway had developed a sophisticated system for selecting and disposing of her victims. She had deliberately targeted travelers who were unlikely to be missed quickly, individuals who were passing through Millbrook rather than establishing permanent residence, people whose absence would not immediately alarm family or business associates. Her method involved careful observation of her guests' circumstances, determining who had family expecting their return and who was traveling alone without fixed plans or regular correspondence. "I was quite selective in my choices," she explained to Sheriff Thornton. "A merchant with a wife expecting his return would be poor selection, as would a laborer with steady employment. I preferred those who were between situations, individuals whose disappearance would be attributed to the natural uncertainties of travel rather than to any specific misfortune." The clinical nature of her victim selection process revealed a level of premeditation that transformed what might have been crimes of passion into calculated acts of predatory murder. Mrs. Holloway's description of her methods proved equally disturbing. She had employed different techniques depending on the physical characteristics and suspected wariness of each victim. For larger, stronger individuals, she had used poison administered in evening meals or bedtime beverages, typically a preparation derived from foxglove that she had learned to extract during her youth in rural Massachusetts. Smaller victims, or those who had consumed significant amounts of alcohol, were dispatched through more direct means, strangulation or blunt force trauma administered while they slept. The interrogation revealed that Mrs. Holloway had not acted entirely alone. She had employed a simple-minded local man named Tobias Fletcher to assist with the physical aspects of disposing of the bodies. Fletcher, who worked odd jobs around Millbrook and was known for his willingness to perform manual labor without asking questions, had been told that he was helping to bury deceased guests who had died of natural causes. Mrs. Holloway had paid him modest sums for his assistance and had sworn him to secrecy about the burials, claiming that public knowledge of deaths at the boarding house would damage her business reputation. Sheriff Thornton's transcript reveals that Mrs. Holloway showed no remorse for her actions, instead expressing frustration that her activities had been discovered before she had completed what she referred to as her collection. When pressed about her motivations, she provided explanations that suggested a profound disconnection from normal human empathy. "These individuals were alone in the world," she stated. They had no one who truly cared for their welfare, no permanent place in any community. I provided them with purpose by making them part of something larger than their individual insignificance. The most chilling aspect of the interrogation was Mrs. Holloway's revelation that she had kept detailed records of each victim. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her private quarters, investigators discovered a leather-bound ledger containing meticulous entries for each murder. The ledger included the victim's name, when known, date of arrival, method of death, date of burial, and personal observations about their character and circumstances. These entries were written in the same careful handwriting that Mrs. Holloway had used for legitimate boarding house business, treating murder with the same administrative attention she had applied to managing room assignments and meal preparations. The discovery of Mary Holloway's meticulously maintained murder ledger provided investigators with a window into the mind of a killer whose methodical approach to death rivaled that of any business enterprise. Prosecutor James Whitfield's detailed analysis of this document, presented as evidence during the subsequent trial, revealed not only the scope of Mrs. Holloway's crimes, but also the disturbing psychology that had driven her to transform hospitality into a systematic harvest of human life. The ledger, bound in brown leather and measuring approximately 8 inches by 10 inches, contained 43 pages of entries written in Mrs. Holloway's precise copperplate handwriting. Each entry followed a standardized format that she had apparently developed to track what she considered the essential information about each victim. The first entry, dated September 12, 1817, documented the death of one Samuel Morrison, age approximately 35, traveling tinker from Massachusetts, and established the template that Mrs. Holloway would follow for the subsequent 18 murders. Prosecutor Whitfield's analysis revealed that Mrs. Holloway had treated each killing as a business transaction requiring proper documentation. The entries included not only basic identifying information, but also detailed observations about each victim's personality, habits, and the circumstances that had made them suitable targets. For Samuel Morrison, she had noted, solitary individual, no mention of family or fixed residence, and drinks heavily in the evenings, claims to be traveling to Portsmouth but appears to have no specific business there, suitable for collection. The clinical language that Mrs. Holloway employed throughout the ledger suggested a complete dissociation from the humanity of her victims. She consistently referred to the murders as collections, the burial process as storage, and the victims themselves as specimens or acquisitions. This terminology, combined with her systematic approach to documentation, indicated that she had developed an elaborate mental framework that allowed her to view murder as a form of scientific or commercial endeavor rather than as the taking of human life. One of the most disturbing aspects of the ledger was Mrs. Holloway's detailed recording of each victim's final moments. She had documented not only the method of death, but also the victim's reactions, the time required for the process to be completed, and her own observations about the effectiveness of different techniques. For a victim identified as Margaret Dunn, seamstress, age 28, Mrs. Holloway had written, subject showed unexpected resistance to foxglove preparation. Required secondary application via pillow compression. Process completed in approximately 8 minutes. Note, smaller individuals may require alternative methods for efficiency. The ledger entries revealed that Mrs. Holloway had experimented with various methods of murder, apparently seeking to refine her techniques for maximum effectiveness and minimum risk of discovery. Early entries documented relatively crude methods, blunt force trauma and manual strangulation, while later entries showed increasing sophistication in the use of poisons and more subtle forms of suffocation. This progression suggested that Mrs. Holloway had approached murder as a skill to be developed and perfected through practice and observation. Prosecutor Whitfield's analysis also uncovered evidence that Mrs. Holloway had maintained correspondence with individuals in other communities, possibly other boarding house operators or individuals involved in similar activities. Several ledger entries contained references to methods suggested by correspondent in Portsmouth or technique recommended by associate in Bangor. These notations raised the terrifying possibility that Mrs. Holloway had been part of a larger network of individuals engaged in systematic murder, sharing techniques and possibly coordinating their activities to avoid detection. The financial aspects of Mrs. Holloway's crimes were also meticulously documented in the ledger. Each entry included a detailed inventory of the victim's possessions and their estimated value, along with notes about how these items had been disposed of. Mrs. Holloway had apparently sold valuable items through various channels, including traveling merchants and peddlers who would carry goods to distant markets where their origins could not be traced. Less valuable items were either kept for her own use or given to local residents as gifts, a practice that had actually enhanced her reputation for generosity within the Millbrook community. The ledger revealed that Mrs. Holloway's victims had collectively possessed assets worth several $100s, a substantial sum for the period, which she had systematically appropriated to fund her boarding house operations and maintain her respectable lifestyle. This financial motivation, however, appeared to be secondary to what she described in several entries as her scientific interest in the process of death and her desire to create what she termed a permanent collection of human specimens. Perhaps most chilling were the entries that documented Mrs. Holloway's emotional responses to her crimes. Rather than expressing guilt or remorse, She had recorded feelings of satisfaction and accomplishment, treating each successful murder as a professional achievement. For the death of Thomas Garrett, carpenter, age 42, she had written, "Excellent specimen, well-preserved physique, minimal struggle, collection process highly satisfactory. Subject now properly catalogued and stored for permanent preservation." The final entries in the ledger, dating from the weeks immediately before the discovery of the bodies, showed that Mrs. Holloway had been planning to expand her operations. She had made notes about acquiring additional property and had sketched plans for what appeared to be a larger burial facility. These plans suggested that she viewed her activities not as a temporary aberration, but as a long-term enterprise that she intended to continue and expand indefinitely. The testimony of Tobias Fletcher, the simple-minded laborer who had unknowingly assisted Mary Holloway in disposing of her victims, provided crucial insight into the practical mechanics of the murders and revealed the extent to which Mrs. Holloway had manipulated those around her to facilitate her crimes. Fletcher's deposition, taken on November 3, 1824, in the presence of Judge Cornelius Hartwell and recorded by court clerk Benjamin Adams, painted a picture of a woman whose ability to deceive and manipulate extended far beyond her treatment of boarding house guests. Tobias Fletcher was a man of limited intellectual capacity, approximately 30 years of age, who had lived in Millbrook his entire life, performing odd jobs for various residents. His testimony, delivered in simple, often fragmented sentences, revealed that his association with Mrs. Holloway had begun in the spring of 1818, approximately 6 months after her first recorded murder. Fletcher's account suggested that Mrs. Holloway had carefully selected him as an accomplice, specifically because of his mental limitations and his desperate need for regular employment. "Mrs. Holloway, she was always kind to me," Fletcher testified, his words carefully recorded by the court clerk. "Other folks in town, they'd give me work sometimes, but she always had something for me to do. Said I was reliable, said I was trustworthy, made me feel important, like I was helping with something special." This testimony revealed Mrs. Holloway's skill in identifying and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of those around her, using Fletcher's desire for acceptance and steady income to secure his unwitting cooperation in her crimes. Fletcher's description of his duties at the boarding house initially appeared routine: chopping wood, carrying water, maintaining the grounds, and performing various repairs. However, his testimony revealed that Mrs. Holloway had gradually introduced him to more unusual tasks, always with explanations that seemed reasonable to his limited understanding. The first burial he had assisted with, according to his account, had been presented as a favor to a guest who had died suddenly of natural causes and whose family had requested a discreet interment to avoid the expense and complications of a formal funeral. "She told me the poor man had no money for a proper burial," Fletcher explained to the court. "They said his family was too proud to accept charity, but too poor to pay for a funeral. She said we were doing a Christian kindness by giving him a decent resting place without making a fuss about it. I thought it was generous of her, taking care of folks even after they passed on." This testimony illustrated how Mrs. Holloway had crafted explanations that would appeal to Fletcher's simple moral understanding while concealing the true nature of her activities. The court deposition revealed that Mrs. Holloway had established a regular pattern for these burials, always conducting them at night and always with explanations that emphasized the need for discretion and secrecy. Fletcher testified that she had convinced him that public knowledge of deaths at the boarding house would damage her business and potentially force her to close the establishment, which would eliminate his primary source of income. This economic threat, combined with his genuine affection for Mrs. Holloway, had ensured his continued cooperation and silence. Fletcher's testimony provided disturbing details about the burial process itself, Mrs. Holloway had always prepared the graves in advance, marking the locations and providing Fletcher with specific instructions about the depth and dimensions required. She had insisted on wrapping the bodies herself, claiming that this was a matter of preserving the dignity of the deceased, and had always been present during the actual interment to ensure that the process was completed according to her specifications. She was very particular about how things were done, Fletcher told the court. Had to be just so deep, had to be lined up just right. He said it was important to show proper respect for the dead. I thought she was being careful because she was a good Christian woman. The systematic nature of these burials, as described by Fletcher, confirmed the investigators' assessment that Mrs. Holloway had planned her activities with considerable forethought and attention to detail. The deposition also revealed that Mrs. Holloway had used Fletcher to dispose of evidence beyond the bodies themselves. He had been instructed to burn clothing and personal effects that she claimed belonged to guests who had left suddenly without collecting their belongings. Fletcher had also been tasked with cleaning the basement thoroughly after each burial, using lime and other substances that Mrs. Holloway claimed were necessary to prevent odors from spoiled food stores. Perhaps most significantly, Fletcher's testimony revealed that he had begun to harbor suspicions about Mrs. Holloway's activities in the months before the discovery of the bodies. He had noticed that guests who were present for evening meals sometimes failed to appear for breakfast, and that Mrs. Holloway's explanations for these disappearances had become increasingly elaborate and contradictory. However, his limited intellectual capacity and his economic dependence on Mrs. Holloway had prevented him from acting on these suspicions or reporting them to authorities. "I started to wonder sometimes," Fletcher admitted during his testimony. "It seemed like a lot of folks were dying sudden-like or leaving without saying goodbye. But Mrs. Holloway, she always had an explanation. And she was so kind to me. I didn't want to think bad thoughts about someone who'd been so good to me." This portion of his testimony highlighted the tragic irony of Fletcher's situation. His loyalty to Mrs. Holloway had made him an unwitting participant in crimes that would have horrified him had he understood their true nature. The revelation of Mary Holloway's crimes sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Millbrook that extended far beyond the immediate horror of the murders themselves. Reverend Ezra Whitmore's personal journal, discovered in the archives of the First Congregational Church in 1967, provides an intimate account of how the community struggled to comprehend and cope with the knowledge that they had harbored a serial killer in their midst for nearly 8 years. His daily entries from October through December 1824 reveal a town grappling with questions of collective responsibility, moral blindness, and the terrifying possibility that evil could masquerade so effectively as virtue. Reverend Whitmore had known Mary Holloway personally, having welcomed her into the congregation when she first arrived in Millbrook following her husband's death. His journal entries from the period immediately following the discovery describe a man wrestling with profound spiritual and psychological turmoil as he attempted to reconcile his previous impressions of Mrs. Holloway with the mounting evidence of her crimes. "I find myself questioning not only my judgment of character, but the very foundations of my faith," he wrote on October 22nd. How could one who appeared so devout, so charitable, so concerned with the welfare of others, harbor such darkness within her soul? The Reverend's observations provide crucial insight into how Mrs. Holloway had successfully integrated herself into the community's social fabric. She had been a regular attendee at Sunday services, contributing generously to church collections and volunteering for various charitable activities. Her boarding house had been recommended by church members to traveling ministers and other visitors, and she had hosted several church social gatherings in her parlor. This level of community integration had not only provided her with a respectable cover for her activities, but had also made the subsequent revelations more psychologically devastating for those who had trusted and supported her. Reverend Whitmore's journal documents the various stages of community response to the scandal. The initial reaction had been one of complete disbelief, with many residents insisting that there must be some mistake or that Mrs. Holloway was being falsely accused. This denial phase was followed by a period of intense scrutiny as community members began to re-examine their previous interactions with Mrs. Holloway, searching for signs they might have missed or warning signals they had failed to recognize. Mrs. Patterson came to see me today, weeping inconsolably, Reverend Whitmore recorded on October 25th. She had recommended Mrs. Holloway's establishment to her nephew when he passed through town last spring. The young man stayed for 3 nights and then continued on his journey to Boston, or so we believed. Now Mrs. Patterson torments herself with the possibility that her recommendation may have led to his death. How many of us bear similar burdens of unknowing complicity? The journal reveals that the community's self-examination extended beyond individual guilt to broader questions about social responsibility and moral vigilance. Town meetings were held to discuss how such crimes could have gone undetected for so long, and various residents came forward with information about unusual occurrences they had previously dismissed as insignificant. Several people reported having noticed the frequent nighttime activity around Mrs. Holloway's property, including the sounds of digging and the movement of carts, but had attributed these observations to normal boarding house maintenance or late arriving guests. Reverend Whitmore's entries also document the economic impact of the scandal on the community. Millbrook's reputation as a safe haven for travelers was severely damaged, resulting in a significant decline in the transient trade that had supported several local businesses. The boarding house itself became a source of morbid fascination, attracting curious visitors from surrounding communities who came to view the site of the murders. But this notoriety did little to compensate for the loss of legitimate business. The psychological toll on the community was perhaps most evident in the children, who struggled to understand why a woman they had known as kind and generous had committed such terrible acts. Reverend Whitmore recorded several instances of children experiencing nightmares and refusing to walk past the boarding house, even after it had been sealed by authorities. Parents found themselves grappling with questions about the nature of evil and the reliability of adult judgment that challenged their ability to provide reassurance and security. Young Timothy Morrison asked me today whether Mrs. Holloway had always been wicked, or whether she had become so through some corruption of her soul, the Reverend wrote on November 8th. I found myself unable to provide an answer that would satisfy either his curiosity or my own understanding. The theological implications of her actions challenge everything I have preached about the fundamental goodness of human nature and the possibility of redemption through faith. The journal also reveals the community's struggle with the question of how to memorialize the victims. Many of the bodies discovered in Mrs. Holloway's basement could not be identified, and there were no family members to claim them or arrange for proper burial. The town ultimately decided to inter the remains in a special section of the local cemetery, marked with a simple monument that acknowledged their tragic fate without sensationalizing the circumstances of their deaths. Perhaps most significantly, Reverend Whitmore's journal documents the lasting changes in community behavior and attitudes that resulted from the Holloway case. Residents became more suspicious of strangers and more vigilant about unusual activities in their neighborhood. The easy trust and hospitality that had characterized small-town life in Millbrook was replaced by a more cautious and questioning approach to social relationships that would persist for generations. The trial of Mary Holloway commenced on December 3, 1824, in the Cumberland County Courthouse in Portland, Maine, drawing unprecedented public attention and establishing legal precedents that would influence American jurisprudence for decades to come. Chief Justice Nathan Weston presided over proceedings that would test the limits of the state's young legal system and challenge conventional understanding of criminal psychology. The complete court records, preserved in the Maine State Archives, document a trial that was as much about the nature of evil itself as it was about the specific crimes committed by the defendant. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Whitfield, faced the unusual challenge of presenting evidence for 19 separate murders while maintaining the jury's focus on the systematic nature of Mrs. Holloway's crimes. Whitfield's opening statement, delivered to a packed courtroom that included representatives from newspapers as far away as Boston and New York, established the prosecution's strategy of demonstrating that the defendant's actions represented not crimes of passion or desperation, but the calculated implementation of a murderous enterprise conducted with businesslike efficiency. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Whitfield declared, "you will hear evidence of crimes so methodical, so deliberately planned and executed, that they challenge our understanding of human nature itself. The defendant did not kill in anger, in fear, or in the heat of passion. She killed as systematically as a farmer harvests grain, viewing human life as a commodity to be collected and stored according to her own twisted purposes." The defense, undertaken by attorney Silas Morton, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client whose guilt was established by overwhelming physical evidence and her own detailed confessions. Morton's strategy focused on establishing Mrs. Holloway's mental incapacity, arguing that no sane person could have committed such acts with such apparent detachment from their moral implications. His opening statement attempted to frame the case as a tragedy of mental illness rather than a matter of criminal culpability. "The evidence will show," Morton argued, "that Mrs. Holloway suffers from a profound disorder of the mind that renders her incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong. Her actions, while undeniably horrific, are the product of a diseased intellect that has lost all connection to normal human emotion and moral understanding. To execute a woman in such a condition would be to punish illness rather than evil." The prosecution's case was built upon the methodical presentation of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Mrs. Holloway's own documented confessions. Dr. Nathaniel Morse provided detailed medical testimony about the condition of the victims and the methods used to kill them, while Constable Blackwood and Deputy Marshal Crane described the discovery and excavation of the burial sites. The presentation of Mrs. Holloway's murder ledger proved particularly compelling, with Prosecutor Whitfield reading selected entries aloud to demonstrate the defendant's calculated approach to her crimes. The testimony of Tobias Fletcher provided crucial insight into the practical mechanics of the murders and Mrs. Holloway's ability to manipulate others into unwitting cooperation. Fletcher's obvious mental limitations and genuine distress at learning the true nature of his activities generated considerable sympathy from the jury and reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of Mrs. Holloway as a master manipulator who exploited the vulnerabilities of those around her. The defense's case relied heavily on medical testimony intended to establish Mrs. Holloway's mental incapacity. Dr. Samuel Gridley, a physician from Boston with experience in treating mental disorders, testified that the defendant exhibited symptoms consistent with what he termed moral insanity, a condition in which the intellectual faculties remained intact, while the moral sensibilities became completely corrupted. Dr. Gridley argued that Mrs. Holloway's ability to maintain a respectable facade while committing systematic murder indicated a profound disconnection from normal human emotion that could only be explained by mental disease. However, the prosecution effectively countered this argument by highlighting the deliberate and rational nature of Mrs. Holloway's planning and execution of her crimes. The systematic documentation in her ledger, her careful selection of victims, and her successful deception of the community for 8 years all suggested a level of cognitive function that contradicted claims of mental incapacity. Mrs. Holloway herself remained largely silent throughout the trial, displaying the same unsettling calm that had characterized her behavior since her arrest. When called upon to testify in her own defense, she declined to do so, stating simply that she had nothing to add to what has already been established. Her demeanor throughout the proceedings, attentive but emotionally detached, reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of her as someone fundamentally different from normal humanity. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 19 counts of murder in the first degree. Chief Justice Weston sentenced Mrs. Holloway to death by hanging, scheduling the execution for February 15, 1825. The verdict was met with approval from the packed courtroom, though several observers noted the absence of the celebratory atmosphere that typically accompanied the conclusion of major criminal trials. The execution of Mary Holloway on February 15, 1825, marked not only the end of one of Maine's most notorious criminal cases, but also a pivotal moment in the state's approach to capital punishment and public justice. The detailed records maintained by Sheriff William Thornton, combined with contemporary newspaper accounts and witness testimonies, provide a comprehensive picture of the final chapter in a case that had captivated and horrified the nation for months. The weeks leading up to the execution saw an unprecedented influx of visitors to Portland, as curiosity seekers, journalists, and legal observers traveled from across New England to witness the hanging of the woman who had become known in the press as the Millbrook murderess. Local authorities struggled to maintain order as crowds gathered outside the jail, and several enterprising merchants established temporary stalls selling pamphlets, broadsides, and even alleged artifacts from Mrs. Holloway's boarding house to the morbidly curious public. Mrs. Holloway's behavior during her final weeks continued to confound those who observed her. Prison chaplain Reverend Marcus Hale, who visited her daily in an attempt to secure a confession and evidence of repentance, found her to be polite, articulate, and completely unrepentant. His journal entries from this period describe a woman who seemed genuinely puzzled by the moral outrage her actions had generated, maintaining until the end that she had provided a valuable service by giving purpose to lives that had otherwise been meaningless. She speaks of her victims as a collector might discuss rare specimens, Reverend Hale wrote. There is no malice in her voice, no recognition of the suffering she has caused. When I attempt to guide her toward repentance, she listens politely but responds as though I am speaking in a foreign language. It is as if the very concept of moral wrongdoing is incomprehensible to her. The execution itself was conducted on a specially constructed gallows erected in the courtyard of the Cumberland County Jail. Sheriff Thornton's official records indicate that approximately 3,000 spectators gathered to witness the hanging, requiring the deployment of additional constables from neighboring communities to maintain order. The crowd included not only local residents but also visitors from as far away as Boston and New York, drawn by the notoriety of the case and the rarity of witnessing the execution of a woman. Mrs. Holloway's final statement, delivered from the gallows platform, provided no satisfaction to those seeking expressions of remorse or explanations for her actions. Speaking in a clear, steady voice that carried across the silent crowd, she maintained her composure and her disturbing perspective until the very end. I have lived according to my understanding of purpose and meaning. Those who condemn me do so from ignorance of the greater design I was serving. I go to my death with the satisfaction of having completed important work. The actual execution was carried out with the efficiency that characterized all aspects of Maine's legal system. Mrs. Holloway showed no signs of fear or distress as the noose was placed around her neck, and contemporary accounts describe her as maintaining her dignity and composure throughout the final moments. The hanging itself was completed without incident, and Dr. Morse pronounced her dead approximately 8 minutes after the trapdoor was released. The aftermath of the execution saw a gradual return to normalcy in Millbrook and the surrounding communities, though the psychological impact of the Holloway case would persist for generations. The boarding house itself was eventually demolished, and the property remained vacant for several years before being purchased by a family from outside the region who were unaware of its history. Local residents established an informal tradition of avoiding the site, and children were warned away from the area where Mrs. Holloway's house had stood. The case's influence on American legal precedent proved significant and lasting. The detailed documentation of Mrs. Holloway's crimes and the systematic nature of her murders provided important insights into criminal psychology that would influence legal thinking for decades to come. The trial established precedents for the presentation of evidence in cases involving multiple murders and contributed to evolving understanding of mental competency in criminal proceedings. Perhaps most significantly, the Holloway case marked a turning point in public attitudes toward capital punishment in Maine. The systematic nature of her crimes and the complete absence of remorse or mental illness that might have mitigated her culpability created a rare instance of public consensus supporting the death penalty. However, the case also sparked broader discussions about the nature of evil and the appropriate response of civilized society to crimes that seemed to transcend normal human understanding. The legacy of Mary Holloway and her 19 victims serves as a permanent reminder of the capacity for evil that can lurk beneath the most respectable facades, and of the vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who view human life as nothing more than material for their own twisted purposes. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.